On the Town was a musical that Comden and Green wrote that's just a great musical and very popular. They do it all the time. And it was the first time anyone saw the amalgam of Lenny's ballet music, Jerry's dance, in a very light, frivolous musical that Comden and Green wrote. It worked really well. I loved it. I actually saw it when I was in college. I saw it 9 times because I thought I'm looking at something new that draws me, elements of which draw me to the musical theater when I've not been drawn there before. Well, it depends on who you talk to. I keep reading that it was offered to us and we turned it down. I don't think that's true at all. I think we were working on a New Girl in Town, which is a musical based on Anna Christie, and I don't think we could have turned it down. Cheryl Crawford certainly did say she'd produce it, and she was a wonderful, really a creative producer with a great record. But the year before she was to do this, she did Candide, and that fell flat on its face. Then, so she said, I can't raise the money twice in a row for these difficult things. And I was on the road with New Girl in Town, which was having problems. It starred Gwen Verdon, and Bobby Fosse was doing the choreography, and it was having real problems between Abbott's view and mine as a producer, and Bobby's and Gwen and Bobby Fosse. We were not in sync about some of the dances, and so it was troublesome. And the phone rang in Boston, and I was in the hotel, and Steve Sondheim called, and I told him my problems. Never occurred to me to ask him what his were, but ours were minimal compared, because we were struggling to get the show finished to come to Broadway, where it did ultimately a couple of weeks later. But then when I was finished, he said, "We've lost our producer. We have no show," being West Side Story. So I said, "Wow, that's just the worst." And I said, if Bobby and I flew in, we have to give the cast off on Sunday. If we flew into New York, could you, Lenny, Jerry, and Arthur Lawrence, who'd written the book really well, could we all meet and Bobby hear the score and I hear the score again? Lenny had told everyone no one was to ever hear this score. And I knew every note of the score because Steve was my friend and he'd play it all the time. So I knew it all. But I had to pretend that I'd never heard any of it. So we went to Lenny's apartment, and they were all there on that Sunday. And Lenny was nervous. He'd never heard anybody pound so loudly on the piano, just in an effort to please. And Steve sang some of the lyrics with Lenny. And it was just as thrilling as anything can be. And I started to sing along inadvertently, and Lenny stopped, and nervous pause, and then he said, "That's what I've always been looking for, is a musical producer." And that's how we got away with it. But we picked up the show, and we said, we will do this show, but you cannot call us and talk to us about any of your problems. We have to get this other show fixed and into New York and open on Broadway, and we'll go to work the next day. We also parenthetically said, you guys are being all paid too much by Cheryl Crawford. It's not that you don't deserve more. It's just not good from an investor's point of view. And we're going to renegotiate all your contracts. Long pause. We did. Because we decided that we knew how to pay shows off quicker than anybody else, which is how we got a quick reputation in the business. And we wanted to continue. Anyway, we came in with New Girl. Reviews very mixed. Show ran, paid back. But I think 6 weeks later than it was meant to go into rehearsal, we actually went into rehearsal with West Side Story, having cast it, having completed the designs, having found the theaters, the bookings. We came to Washington, to the National, and it was spectacular from the get-go in front of audiences. Oh, it's just thrilling. You knew right away. My memory is that the only thing that ever got fiddled around with forever was Somewhere, which was a song top of the second act, where Riri Grist, the opera singer, sat in the pit and sang. She wasn't seen by the audience, and there was a whole big ballet between the Jets and the Sharks, and that just got fiddled with and fiddled with and fiddled with until finally we had to open. But it was quite thrilling, and I left someone out of all this who was really wonderful because he was so supportive, and he had been part of the original team with Cheryl, and that's Roger Stevens, who's a big figure in Washington, of course, and responsible for the Kennedy Center and Lincoln Center complex and so on. A wonderful guy, and he just said, "I'm with you. I'll put up my share. You guys do the producing, and in association with Roger Stevens," and he was true to his word and really nice. They'd never seen anything quite like it. They were just thrilled, just excited. It just got right. The blood boils, and it's exciting. And the Romeo and Juliet story's pretty swell. It was very. Arthur Lawrence created a language for it, which some people are fond of saying, what is all that cracko-jacko stuff, womb to tomb stuff? You had to create a different language, which is probably why sometimes, you talk to Sondheim and you heard him criticize some of his lyrics. The fact that it's all heightened and people are not real and they're not really saying what they would have said in the words they would have used, I think that would have been an impossible task and inappropriate. So, all these people got together and made it larger. And the big place where we encountered, I think, a schism was Officer Krupke, because the authors all said, I mean, what in hell are all these, street kids doing psychoanalysis? What do they know about that? And the answer is, you're right, but the show's getting heavier, too heavy, and we need to lighten the audience's load. And we did. It wasn't Fidelio. It was West Side Story, and it was trying something new in the commercial theater. We had 175 investors put up $250,000, and they stayed with me, those 175 investors, for most of my producing career, when I was producing and directing my own shows, which is something Abbott had done. I directed and produced the shows. And the point is, as in Cabaret, the point is that they didn't need us on Broadway. They had Rodgers and Hammerstein doing just fine, and Fuhrer and Martin doing just fine, and Leland Hayward and the Theater Guild need us. So when we decided to do the first show, we had to analyze, what can we do that will impress people immediately that there are new boys in town and that we found a different way to invent the wheel. And we figured that the way to do that was to do a show as elegantly as it required, but cheaper in terms of costs than anybody was doing them, and get the money back to the investors as soon as possible. Well, Pajama Game investors, the day after the opening, reading the reviews in the paper, also opened their mail and found a check for 10% of their investment, along with a great review in the newspaper. It takes a lot of smugness, I guess, or chutzpah to know that that's going to happen, but we were pretty sure, and we did that. We did it again on the next show, and we just kept doing it for a while. Pajama Game cost $169, Damn Yankees cost $162, and so they got paid off in 10 weeks, 12 weeks. They were into profits right away, and so everybody, not only were they thrilled with the hits, but they were thrilled with the return they were making on their money. I think it's very important in the commercial theater to return the investment. I know there are fewer and fewer people who agree with me, because the investor now is so wealthy in his own right that he's the producer. So you look at a Broadway show today, and you'll see a whole lot of names over the title, and really who they are is the people who put up the money to put the show on, and they can take a loss if it doesn't happen, and it's a shot at a Tony Award and all that sort of thing, and they enjoy the theater, but it isn't the safeguard that I think it doesn't restrain you the way it did us to have to make it a good investment. It also, and see if I can make sense out of this, after a bunch of successes at the box office, it gave us the right to have failures that did something we divined was important for the musical theater form. In other words, you could say to the investor, and I would do it in a letter, I'm not certain you'll ever see this money again, but you've been doing just fine, and then we do Follies or Pacific Overtures, or you do a show that you had to do for artistic reasons that, in fact, ultimately, in case of both those shows, are somewhat historical. But they never returned a plug nickel to anybody. But the investors didn't care because they took a pride in being part of the process. Because of the escalating costs, you can create something artistic. The problem is that do you want to? And are you caving into the audience? There's one definitive moment. It's in the road. It's the moment when you, as a producer or even a director, decide that you're giving the audience what it wants rather than taking the audience on a journey you want it to take. West Side Story is a perfect example of taking the audience somewhere. When it first opened, 100 people walked out on that show every night for a year. Lots of people didn't get it. It didn't win the Tony Awards or any of that stuff, but here it is, and it did pay off, and it made a film that they benefited from. The point is, I still believe you have to take your audience somewhere, and don't underestimate how damn smart they are and how willing to be stimulated. But the situation is parlous at the moment. It's a different world, not just the theater world. It's just a different world. The whole entertainment industry and all this reality television and the business of being copycats all the time. That was something you didn't want to do. You didn't want to copy anybody. You wanted to be the first to do something. My partner had died by then, and I was alone and fearful. I wasn't sure. We'd had 3 partners, then 2, and then me. And he died of a heart attack on the golf course, and there, so I had already done a couple of shows that succeeded after he died, so I had some credibility, and my office was on its feet again. But Fiddler on the Roof, they asked me to direct Bach and Harnick, and I said, though I'm Jewish, that's not my family background, so I don't know it. Mine is German. I don't understand shtetls. Sheldon Harnick gave me a book about shtetls, and I thought I'd be fraudulent. I don't feel this. So I said, get Jerry Robbins, and he wasn't available. And I said, instead, I'll do your other musical, which was She Loves Me, which was a great start for me in terms of people knowing I knew what I was doing, and a musical I love. But then they went back to Jerry, and Jerry said, get Hal Prince to produce it. So, and so I said yes, and that seemed the perfect combination. And indeed, for Jerry, it was a hymn to his father. He did it for his father, and his initial dance teacher played the old rabbi, in the original production of Fiddler on the Roof. Jerry insisted and insisted and insisted on that opening number being larger and engulfing a huge audience that wasn't Jewish, that didn't know about shtetls and so on. And over again, they'd talk about it. And then finally one day somebody used the word tradition, and he said, that's it, write about tradition. That everybody has. So the show has been as great a success in Tokyo as it was on Broadway. And anywhere there's tradition. Well, where isn't there tradition? Actually, unfortunately, there's less tradition today. And that's a terrible loss, culturally, to all of us, than there used to be. But that time, tradition was just international. Every country held on to that tradition, and the show succeeded because of it. I really was interested in theater from the get-go, and that's very lucky. I mean, I went to theater when I was 8 years old. Every Saturday afternoon, we went to theater. That was a routine. And they really weren't particularly aggressively highbrow eggheads, but they took me to some very odd stuff. The first show I ever saw was Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater production of Julius Caesar. And it's an 8-year-old. That's pretty strange stuff, and I've never forgotten it. You never forget the initial experiences you have, you know. But then I saw all the great actors, and I saw plays, very few musicals. I caught up with a few musicals, but they always struck me as kind of silly, which is why I suppose so few of the musicals I've done have been appropriately silly. My father was on a stock exchange. He was on the market down on Wall Street. And my mother was what we used to call a housewife. But she, as a young person, she had known Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart and Dorothy Fields she went to school with. And she'd been in a show, an early Rodgers and Hart show it was the last show before they went professional. And she sang and stuff. So she had that affection that people have for that. So no one ever tried to talk me out of my calling, you know. I caught on to plays as a reading matter. I don't do that much anymore, but I think it must have been a hell of a good idea because I knew all those plays, all the history of plays from the even pre-turn of the 20th century, and I read them all and loved reading them to the exclusion sometimes of great books. But and then I got to know. Very early on, very lucky, I got to know a lot of those playwrights, be in the same room with Robert Sherwood and his like. There were a lot of great playwrights around. Sidney Kingsley I knew very well, and Elmer Rice I met, a whole lot of people like that. I knew the Rodgers family, Mary and Linda and Dick and Dorothy, and they were very generous about young people being around. So you'd spend your Christmas Eve at their house. A lot of young people, Steve Sondheim included. And then I got a job very early. I got a job with George Abbott, who was one of the preeminent director, producers, playwrights. He wrote melodramas, he wrote musicals. He directed the first Rodgers and Hart musical, Jumbo. He did all that stuff, and he had a hugely successful career that went for 75 years. And he took me on it as a 20-year-old. I had written him, and coming out of college, I was terrified of how do you find a job? So I wrote him a letter to his office, and I said, I don't know what I could ever do that would be worth any money at this point. I've had so little experience. So if you would take me on and make me useful, let me be useful. If you can tell that you're not paying me, that was the suggestion, by the nature of what I do, then please fire me right away. And the letter was so curious that I went there to work and stayed there. And then we shared an office, and then I became producer, and then I became, and he was the director of the shows I produced with my partner, and then I became a director, and we shared offices, and he died at 107. 12, 13 years ago, I'm not certain, but I kept his name on the door until I moved offices. When I moved office, the whole thing seemed a little macabre. My wife said, I think you're really overdoing it. You're in your 70s. You can stop that now. Oh, a whole lot of stuff like the adding machine. Clifford Odets, that's an Elmer Rice play, wonderful. I liked impressionistic plays. I loved O'Neill. And actually, among the earliest plays I read was The Great God Brown, and it's a show I ended up directing on Broadway for the Phoenix Theater years later. And it got well received. It's a hell of a complicated play in which people carry masks and confront each other behind masks, then put the masks down, and you hear what they're really thinking. It's a device he then used later on in Strange Interlude when people spoke to each other and then spoke what they were really thinking. And what's interesting about that play, aside from the fact that I loved it, is that it was autobiographical. And if you look at Long Day's Journey into Night, it's a young man's covered version of telling that story because he was a young man when he wrote it. I admired him enormously because he played games with theater, and he knew traditional Japanese theater and German theater and Russian theater, and he used all those techniques. It's the kind of theater I like and I gravitate to still. Childhood is painful. Not everyone's, but I don't know too many people doing that are my colleagues who didn't have some painful childhood, and not necessarily imposed on you by your parents. Certainly not deliberately. It's probably just something born in you. But I was very solitary, and I escaped into fantasies. And this is, by the way, very common. I read Julie Harris at one point said she used to play with a stage and so on, and lots of playwrights have done that. And I did. I had a stage, and I'd perform things just for me on it. I'd listen to the opera on Sundays, and Milton Cross would tell the opera story, and then the opera would start. See, the great golden curtain at the Met, the old Met on 37th Street, has gone up. Ladies and gentlemen, rises on, and then I would have set the stage and follow but I didn't speak the language they were singing in, so of course sometimes I was way behind them and the great golden curtain would fall, and sometimes I would be finished with Act One and they would still be singing, I would have loved to have been a playwright and a director, but I have too much respect for writing. So it's very useful to have some facility for writing if you're a director. An articulate director is a good thing. And hard to believe there are some very successful ones who are not articulate and who are reduced to saying, no, that's not what I want. Try something else. I wouldn't be one of those guys. And I do know how to sort of improvise a scene, and then the playwright will go away and bring it back much improved. I do the kind of acting that, when you direct large companies of musicals, you get everyone from Angela Lansbury, who knows it all, to somebody who is just starting and perhaps doesn't know anything, and has much training, doesn't know technique, and so on. And you give line readings, and you actually lay a performance on them like a coat. And that kind of acting I'll do. It's very big and embarrassing, but they get the essence of where I'm trying to take them. I can't read music, and though I directed a lot of operas, everywhere, in Vienna, in Buenos Aires, in this country, all over the place. And I did it because some years ago I knew John Dexter, the playwright and an Englishman, a very talented guy, died too young. And John and everybody else who was directing in Europe was doing operas as well. What is it about America that has has cut that off. It's changing now. Peter Gelb is beginning to ask theater directors to direct at the Met, but it's very rare. So I did an interview, and I thought, if you publish this, it may be read. And so I was asked, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to try directing operas. And I got a telegram in Europe from Carol Fox, who ran the Chicago Lyric Opera, which is one of the best opera companies in the country, saying, how would you like to open our season with Fanciulla del West? And I thought, I've seen it, I don't know it. I wrote back and said, I think I'm very interested. I'll listen to it again. And I did open the season, and it stayed in the repertoire. It's in the repertoire. And it's been done in San Francisco with Placido, and Carol Neblett did it often. And it was the beginning. Then I did a lot of stuff. You learn the music by ear, and I'm that awful thing. I'm that director who walks in with a play script, and they're all working from the score, and you see the eyebrows go up, and then suddenly somebody will say, "Hey, you really do have some sense of music, don't you?" I'll tell you, I've done a lot of Puccini because he's a great theatrical man, theater man, and so when I would come to a scene, and I wanted to take a pause, I wanted an actor to walk across a stage and open some drapes and look out at the countryside and breathe a sigh of sadness. So did he, because it would be in the music, always in the music. And it gave me a hint I was on the right track. I started out being an office boy. The water was in bottles, very heavy, and you came in the morning and turned them over into the machine, and the water cooler. You opened the windows. There was no air conditioning. This is all in 1948, and then I did the mail, and then if there were odd deliveries, and then I hung around, and then he signed a contract. He wanted to try out television, so he signed a contract. He opened a little firm. He was married then to his second wife, and he opened a firm with some people, and they did some shows, game shows and stuff, and I sort of took the people who were in the game show to the commissary for meals and stuff. But then he signed a contract for an original show. This is all by 1949, and he said it would be called the Hugh Martin Show. Hugh Martin's a great composer who is still alive. It took place in a living room, and it was a musical show. And Butterfly McQueen was in it, playing the maid those times, and Kay Ballard was in it, and Hugh Martin, and a lot of guys singing and stuff. And Abbott wrote the first show and directed it up at 104th and Riverside Drive, or up in the hills above the Hudson, and he hated doing it. And so he hired another couple of playwrights to write the second show. And the second show came in on a Friday, and he was gone playing golf somewhere. And I opened the second show, and I thought, he's going to hate this. This is just not what he's been doing at all. So on Monday morning, I heard a shout from his office, and he said, "Will you come in here? I just got the script from California. Damn, I have to write a whole half-hour television show." And I said, "I wrote one over the weekend in case you'd like to see it." And he said, "Give it to me." And I gave it to him, and he said, "It's fine. Let's do it just your way. And why don't you direct it?" And I said, "What are you saying?" He said, "You can direct. I've been watching you. Go direct it." So, and I said, "Are you going to?" The actors, no one's going to listen to a 20-year-old. He said, I was probably 21 by then. He said, "No, go ahead, direct it. I'll come on Thursday and make some comments." So the actors did look at me strangely. It bore his name, the script, so we didn't have to go over that. And I directed the show, and he came in and made a nip or a tuck there or something, not much. and the show went on the air. But I was a very abrasive kid. I mean, it wasn't. The energy level was just too high. I was trying hard to be tactful, but I had a lot of ambition. And one of the things I never wanted to be was a producer. So that when it says producer, director here, I think, well, okay, I guess that's history, but the truth is it's not anything I ever wanted to be. The amount of kinetic energy I gave off, which was clearly spurred by too much ambition, drove them all a little bit nuts, and they went to Abbott and said, he's okay and he knows what he's doing, but it's very abrasive. And he said, so please come back. And he said, no, it's him or no show. And he stood up for me. And the show went off the air. And I stayed with Abbott. And he knew what I wanted was to be backstage with the show. So the first opportunity he got, he put me as an assistant stage manager on a review that Gene and Walter Kerr had written called Touch and Go. And it opened here in Washington, D.C., at Catholic University, where they were teaching. It's that show that brought them to Broadway. And he brought it in because it got such good reviews. It was a review. And I went backstage, and my boss was his longtime stage manager, Bobby Griffith. And he decided to show me the ropes. And he did. And then he let me run the show. And that was when it was pretty evident to me, not anyone else, I was one step ahead of the sheriff, that I was not made to be a stage manager, because I did 2 more shows, but I always called the cues the way I would have liked them to be. I changed the tempo of the scene changes just slightly because I felt like it would be better if these overlapped. It would be better if this moved more. And so early on, I would catch the stagehands still moving the scenery. They had to fall behind a couch and hang there for the balance of the scene. But that's the way it happened. He sent me out on the road to look at his shows that were touring. And I never knew quite why, because he sent Bobby half the time, and that was what Bobby had always done. But he sent me sometime. And years later, he said, that was your audition. I kept getting reports back saying he had a good rehearsal. He's pulled the show together where it's needed and so on. So he's the first person ever said to me, you really can direct, and you are a director, be a director. I got drafted, which is the greatest thing that ever happened to me. The Korean War started, and I was the first person drafted in Manhattan because I'd missed out on World War II. And it took me away for 2 years and calmed me down. It was not my game plan. It's not the way I saw it playing itself out. And instead, I found myself in Fort Bliss, Texas, and then I found myself in Indianapolis with a National Guard first, and then Fort Bliss, and then I got sent for my second year to Germany, the occupation forces. And that was wonderful because I'd never been to Europe, and it introduced me to all of Europe. And I went everywhere but England, always by train. Generally, the war was just over, so everything was just demolished in Germany, and yet there were opera houses still functioning, ballet companies still working. There was theater, and I was outside of Stuttgart, and I hung out in a little bar in Stuttgart called Maxim's, which was in a bombed-out church. And there was a little guy, an MC, with lots of makeup and eyeshadow and stuff. And there were 3 huge Valkyrie ladies in diaphanous gowns galumphing around. And you'd have a couple of drinks and watch him try to get a small and audience into it, enthusiastic. And he was very obsequious and hardworking and sweat a lot. And years later, 1966, when we hadn't quite figured out how to do Cabaret. We'd done a version, and I thought it's not exciting enough. I drew on that guy and brought a friend in, Joel Gray, and introduced him to Kander and Ebb, and they wrote for him, and that was the MC. I didn't want to dislocate the air. I didn't want to push people aside. I certainly wasn't Sammy Glick, or J. Pierpont Finch. But in How to Succeed in Business, I think it's useful to say. But when I came back from the Army, I reminded myself of the problems that I had escaped by being drafted. And so at the top of my calendar on my desk, I wrote 2 words, and I wrote them for the next 5 years. Watch it. Just watch it, with an exclamation point. And so when I'd come into work in the morning, I'd see those 2 words that were saying, calm down. And I watched it. You need to be diplomatic. You know what? I think I am diplomatic. I'm also older, and you get to be my age, and you carry in a room inadvertently some reaction that you get from people. You've been around so damn long that you don't have to work on that. But I think my stronger suit was stimulating people, was because I'm excitable, and I'm excited about what I do, and I think it connects with people. The whole creative process is the biggest turn on in the world, and I like that. I like collaboration. You see, and you have to, if you want to be in the theater, you have to like the give and take. We were in the wings, stage managing a show called Wonderful Town, which was a huge hit that Bernstein had written the music for, and Comden and Green the book, and Rosalind Russell, a big movie star, was the leading lady. And I just got very impatient. I thought, you've been away for 2 years, you're back. We really ought to do more with our lives. Bobby was 20-some-odd years older than I, and adored by everybody, but he wasn't going to do anything. And so, a little Iago-like, I whispered in his ear, let's move on. And that appealed to him. My energy appealed to him. And there was a review in the New York Times of a book called 7.5 Cents, and he was working on something else at the time and could not. He read the review and said, read the review, and if you like it, read the book, and if you like it, get the book. So I read the review, and I rushed and got the book, read it ever so quickly, found the agent, called the agent, went to see the agent, who was a fellow named Harold Matson, a very, very important and highly esteemed fellow. And he had offers from other people because of that review. One of them from Leland Hayward, who was a big-time producer who'd done South Pacific. But he bet on the 2 kids, or what George always called us the kids. There were a lot of years separating us, but he called us that. And Roz Russell heard about it and said, my husband, who is a movie guy, nice man named Freddie Brisson, will you take a partner? And we said, sure, raise the money. Where are we going to get the money? In those days, $250,000. Today, $12 million. And so we did do that, and he did bring in some money, and we did the rest by doing backers auditions. So it turned into the biggest hit of the season instantly, which was a wonderful thing. However, I stayed stage managing. Bobby stopped, I staged. We did a second show the next year called Damn Yankees, and I stage managed that. I wanted the salary, which was something like $175 a week. they're not remotely characteristic of my career as a director. Not remotely, but I'm a pragmatic fella. And when you work with George Abbott, it's a George Abbott musical. When you work with Jerome Robbins, it's a Jerome Robbins musical. And then when you work for yourself, you take so much that you observe from other successful directors, but then there's one moment where you have to say, this career isn't gonna happen the way I want it to happen, unless I express myself. I don't want to get lost. I've always heard that theory about get lost in the material. That's the dearly to be desired. But I don't believe it for 1 minute. I think you want to be visible on that stage, and that happened. It happened really. I did a wonderful show before Cabaret called She Loves Me, but it looked so smooth and tasteful and so on. Cabaret did something else. So wait a minute, this is different. We have never seen this before. Bob Fosse was brought to George. He'd been on film, and he'd choreographed his own stuff on film with Carol Haney, who got a Tony Award and was in The Pajama Game. And he was in Kiss Me Kate as one of the dancers. He choreographed their section of one of the from this moment on, actually. He was married to a dancer, Joan McCracken, who was very famous and one of the original leading dancers in Oklahoma. She was an Agnes DeMille dancer, and she was married to Bobby, and she said, my husband's a great choreographer. So Abbott said, why don't we take our chances? Everybody practically was new on that show. The composers, Adler and Ross, the choreographer. The only thing is, if you look at the billing, you'll see it says directed by George Abbott and Jerome Robbins. And that was my doing. I wanted to ensure that show was going to work. And I said, how do you know all these elements? It's one thing that the songs are coming in and you can say, I don't like that, write another one. But when it gets to choreography, how do you know? And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd love to ask Jerry if he'd be willing to stand by. Ask him. So I asked Robbins, and he said, only if I can have co-directing credit. And I said, oops. And I went back to the office and I said to George, Mr. Abbott in those days, no go. He wants co-directing credit. And without a pause, he said, give it to him. And I said, what are you saying? He's not going to direct. He may come in if we need him to tidge up a few dances, which is precisely what he did. Not a great deal, very little. He said, what do we care? Everybody will know who directed this show. So that's how he got it. And it served to tell the world that Jerome Robbins wanted to be a director. That's how he told them. I believe it was, and I believe it's been copied probably. You can't copy West Side Story. You can't even copy Phantom of the Opera, though God knows a lot of people have tried, deciding that Dracula is, or the Hunchback, but you can't. But Cabaret, you can copy the technique. You can have an MC under a different guise. You can have vaudeville numbers separated from the book. Chicago did that some years later, but a number of shows. The Act, a show that Liza Minnelli was in, did that. It keeps coming back in as a form. I think we were the nobody's ever the first, but nobody's ever pointed out where it was done before. Well, that takes you back to where I went to theater when I was 8 years old. I every once in a while they'd take me to a musical. Let me just share two musical plots with you. One was called Too Many Girls, a big hit of Rodgers and Hart's. My mom took me to that, and I kept, and the plot basically was the ingenues at Potawatomi College wore beanies, but when they didn't have the beanie on, it meant that they were no longer virgins. The heroine came out on stage in the second act without a beanie, and the audience went nuts laughing. That was that plot. Another one was an Ethel Merman show called Something for the Boys, and it was a Cole Porter show, big hit during the war. And in it, she got graphite on her teeth, and so her teeth inadvertently became a message center for Nazi spies. I rest my case. I don't know. I guess it is when when people say they're doing that Nazi musical in rehearsal over there. None of that ever got to me. Actually, there's a West Side Story. We were in rehearsal, I think, at what's now the Richard Rodgers, the 46th Street Theater, and I was standing on the street, and I was getting some air, and Leland Hayward walked by, and I had been in his office working at one point. Abbott had sent me over to work for him. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "We're doing West Side Story." And he put an arm on my shoulder and he said, "Good, it's time you had a flop," and walked on down the street smiling. And it was meant in a jocular fashion, but it spoke for the industry and what everybody thought. Nobody knows. George Firth had written a bunch of plays, and Steve said to me, "I have a friend named George Firth who's written a bunch of one-act plays for Kim Stanley to star in. Will you read them? It doesn't seem to be happening, though she's very interested." So I read 7 plays, and I said, "Well, all I could see reading them," he writes, "Great, Steve," but all I could see was Kim Stanley running to make costume and wig changes and makeup changes while it just exhausted me. That's as far as my imagination would take me. But I'll tell you what, it's a musical. And he said, "It is?" And he called George, and we met in my office, and I said, "Yes, guys, it's a musical." And they went and struggled, and Steve brilliantly figured out how to write a score for a show that did not move the show along, and it was not where the songs were not internal to the scenes, preserving George Firth's unique writing and at the same time amplifying the relationships between scenes, interrupting a scene and doing a number and so on. So it's a very uniquely contrived and brilliant score. And I felt comfortable on the birthday parties, which were dark. It was all started with a birthday, ended with a birthday, and they reappeared. They're right up my alley. And that's something that got added and to the show, and the show bubbles a lot of the time, but there's a dark spine somewhere there. Some good reviews, some ghastly reviews. There's a picture of Steve and me with our arms around each other in dinner clothes, and I just told him the review in the Times was lousy. And we just kept smiling while the guy took our picture. It was a realistic show about a bunch of people who go to a theater and get very drunk and start to fight with props that were on the walls from an old musical, and it eluded me, so what happened was we added ghosts, we added other people, we added alter egos for everybody in the cast, and a terrific sense of mystery. À la recherche de temps perdu. We wanted to put something gauzy and melancholy on that stage while telling this story of lost dreams and so on. And the guys did brilliantly. And then, of course, the apotheosis, big moment in the thing was when all the 4 leading characters and the four leading characters in their youth all converged on stage, circled each other, screamed at each other, and that erupted in a Follies section, a real Ziegfeld Follies section. Steve said, I won't write Company unless you agree to do Follies right after it, because Follies was ready and Company wasn't. So I said, of course I do, but we have to get it to this next stage. So I'm sure glad I did it. But that was one of the reasons. The other reason is Company paid off. Company paid back its investment. So when they did Follies was the most expensive musical ever done, with more costumes, more scenery, more everything, because it was a Ziegfeld Follies, and it cost $800,000. That's all. Today, you can't do a straight play for $800,000. Sweeney was very much Steve's show. I didn't get it. I got it as I went along. It's about revenge, and I don't think I'm a vengeful guy. I don't think I feel revenge. I recognize its existence. The idea of it drains me, it hurts my energy level. So it's about revenge. But I got into it, and I got into it because it's very possible I imposed something on it. No one else who's done it since has ever done that. I wanted it to have some social significance, and I realized the story takes place during the beginning of the industrial age in England, and that all of these people, obviously it turns to cannibalism. Some of them don't even know that they're inadvertently cannibals. But basically, I thought they're all sharing one thing. They never breathe clean air. They never see sunlight. They are, from the day they're born to the day that they die, they're victims. And so I said to Eugene Lee, let's do it in a factory, and let's put a glass roof on it that makes it claustrophobic, and let's tell all of these people that they're in the same spot, really, as the two leading characters in the play, that they're all victims of the industrial age. And this is a time when kids were on the assembly line for 14 hours a day doing piecework and so on. And that pulled the whole show together for me. And oddly enough, it's never been done since, and there certainly are its detractors who think, why did he bother? But I bothered because it made it possible for me to direct it, and I did a good job. I have not seen Company. I saw Sweeney Todd with Michael Cerveris. I saw it actually in London first with that company, and it was so totally different and so totally of another thing that I had a fine time. I didn't, honestly, I didn't think it was clear. I didn't think, I think its audience, which after all it ran, 8 months, 9 months, I thought its audience had probably, a lot of it, seen the show before, so they could follow the story in the second act. I wasn't sure they could remotely follow the story if they hadn't some familiarity with it, because it's a very complicated story. Now that was a big flop. That was a disaster, and we worked very hard and made quite a good show of it. I think we were hurt by a decade of what seemed to everybody like unceasing success, and too many awards and too much publicity that you don't seek. It just, there's your picture, both of you. And I think it hurt us. So we were not allowed to work on it. Everybody watched it from the first preview when it wasn't working till it closed when we thought it was well on the way to working. And if it had someone else's name on it, it might very well have gotten a chance. I have a small story there where I was not true to myself, and I will always feel guilty. Whatever I did with that show, I was convinced that it should be done our town style, on a bare stage in a theater with nothing, and just some racks of clothes that kids would put on to play scenes. And I called my office together, my staff, and I said, I can't see this show in scenery. I can't see this show in costumes. These kids are playing life, and it goes awry, but and it's backwards in time. And they said, you must do what you must do. And I didn't, because I thought, we're going to charge people, whatever it was in those days, $20 a seat. We're going to charge them to walk into a theater where there's nothing on the stage. And I didn't have the guts. Big mistake. I should have done that. And I regret it. It comes back often. And they just keep changing. They change the casting. They do it with older people playing young people. I still prefer young people playing old people. I still think that was right. But they've never brought it all the way back. I mean, I think Eric Schaefer did a production here that they thought would get to Broadway. It hasn't. Steve Sondheim's score is dazzling. Firth's book is wonderful and a little complicated places, but really, I will never get past wishing I had listened to myself, but I ran scared. I was living in Spain. We were living in Mallorca, and Tim actually arrived with a tape of this show about Eva Perón, and he played the tape, and I listened, and the opening number, which had been recorded by the London Symphony Orchestra, they had that kind of money to do that, and with a huge chorus. And I said, this opening is 200,000 people in front of the Casa Rosada at Eva's funeral. Wow, it's so exciting, I can't stand it. How the hell do you do that? And I was hooked. So I sat down, listened to all of it, thought it was all marvelous, and wrote 3,000-word letter saying what I thought should happen and what I would love to do. And I got back a letter saying, we're doing a record, and your letter's terrific, but it's going to slow us down and just make us lose confidence. So thanks so much for the time and trouble. And I thought, I'll never hear from them again. And they went on, did the record. A year and a half later, the record came out, was a huge hit in Europe, and I'm sitting in my office, and my receptionist says, there are two young men in the front office who want to see you. They don't have an appointment. And I said, I'll look. I looked. It was them. And they said, we wanted to bring you the record. Now we're ready. Are you ready to do the show? And I said, sure. And I was busy, and they had to wait another year for me. But it was one of the most exhilarating and extraordinary experiences, because it was, I insisted they put some spoken dialogue in it. Not much, but in key places. But mostly it's numbers. It's in sort of whatever that Brechtian style is, and the energy of it really worked for all of us, and the show worked immediately in London. So that was my introduction to them. The next time around, they had broken up. Tim was working on Chess, and Andrew wanted to do Phantom of the Opera. And I was sitting in a restaurant, and he was sitting at the next table with Sarah Brightman, to whom he was then married. And he said, come over and have coffee. And he said, I'm thinking of Phantom of the Opera as a musical. What do you think? And I said, it's the perfect time for a romantic musical. Perfect. There hasn't been a romantic musical in years. And it's what I would like to see. That's often a criterion. I very often do what I wish I could see when I went to the theater. So it's sort of make your own theater, really. And I signed on immediately. And we spent the next 2 years working on it. I spent a lot of flights back back and forth to London. The scenery itself took 9 flights there and about 3 for Maria Bjornson. It needed to take an audience where an audience probably could not remember being, but it needed to take them back to being me seeing Orson Welles at the age of 8 in Julius Caesar. You needed to go in there and say, I've just lost all my problems, all the years of patina that have developed and crushed, and just be in this other world. And insofar as it does that, it seems to have succeeded in its objective. Our rehearsal started at 10 every morning in Lambeth in a school, in a gymnasium. And at 1 I would leave, having staged a section of it, sometimes 12:30. And then I would leave my assistant to review what I'd done, and then Gillian Lynn would take the rest of the time for choreography. And there is some choreography in the show. And then I wouldn't come back till the next day. So we rehearsed for 4 weeks. At the end of 4 weeks, we had a run-through. At the end of the run-through, I said, next Monday we meet in Her Majesty's Theater. I've been over all the props and the effects, and we're ready for you. And you've done a wonderful job. And one of the cast raised a hand and said, I've been delegated to ask you a question. And I said, go ahead, what is it? What do you do in the afternoon? I'm very organized, and I don't sit around and do little dots and drawings. When you first start directing, the very first job I ever got, which was stock job directing, you do little drawings of where you want your actors to go in the scenery. The first play was Angel Street, Gaslight, I think the movie was called. And then you go in and you start to rehearse the actors, and then the actors, one of them says, I'd love to try going in that direction instead. And there's your whole job gone. Somebody who goes somewhere you didn't want them to go. What about all the rest of those people? And so preparation is another kind of thing. Preparation is getting everything you need to know of a sensory nature about the characters, where the story's taking place, all those things. I mean what things smell like, taste like, sound like, and so on. And that's an exercise you share with your art, with your designer as well. Boris Aronson taught me that years ago. He was the greatest designer that ever lived, I think. And he would never design it. I never saw him pick up a pen and draw something and say, what do you think of this? Instead, he'd say, what do you think let's talk about the food. Let's talk about what the restaurants were like. Let's talk about the sound on the street. Let's talk about, and so Cabaret, for one, was a black box with selective bits of scenery and one huge surprise. And I looked at the model for the first time, and there was this waffled, wobbly funhouse mirror angled at the audience. And they came in and sat down, and they could see this distorted view of themselves. And it's like saying, that's your metaphor, folks. Sort of like the factory in Sweeney. Abbott very simply taught a lot of people the same thing, self-discipline, that the theater is a job you have to do, that you have no time to indulge because you're making, quote, art, end quote, and show up on time, get the work done. That's a huge thing to learn. Honor their difficulties, but don't encourage their neuroses, because nothing creative comes out of that. That, and of course, he said, you're a director. All you need in this world as a young person is one person who knows and who you respect to say, you can do this, do it. Because most people are telling you you can't and don't. I have 2 left feet. But my direction is characterized I think, in some of the best work by movement and by how I will move a block of people you would call an ensemble or a chorus. And they are moving the way dancers would move. Their feet aren't doing anything because I wouldn't know how to tell them that. But I can move them. Jerry moved people diagonally across a stage, from upstage down, directly downstage, turn around, move directly upstage. Strange energies come from all of that. The theater that he entered and that I entered moved laterally. They'd drop a drop and things would move from left to right or right to left. They'd change the scenery upstage. You'd open, there'd be doors. I haven't had a door in a show for as long as I can remember. And that whole world of inviting the audience to use its imagination and fill in the blank spaces is the difference between what I do and what people who do realistic films and so on do. Films weren't always realistic. I love old black and white silent films. They were forced perspective and all kinds of strange, wonderful things that I use in the theater. I'm a huge admirer, as you know, of Wells. It started with that Mercury Theater production. I do think Citizen Kane is as nourishing to me, a theater director, as anything I've ever done. And some of the work I've done is an homage. If you take a look at the opera scene in Phantom of the Opera, believe me, I wasn't thieving, but I was certainly totally paying homage to the opera scene in Citizen Kane. I thought he was just wonderful. I love larger than life. I love people tearing into the theater and saying it's a black box, the energy. There's an energy there that you can really harness that, is harder on film. Kazan made some great films. On the Waterfront is just a great film. And the film version of Streetcar is extraordinary. But Streetcar seems like the play to me, seems like a play in a claustrophobic place with people giving performances that they gave on the stage. No, you really don't know, but it's also very important that you make the distinction between success and failure and hit and flop. Follies was a huge success that lost all its investment money. Hits are shows that do well at the box office, and some of them I wouldn't want my name on. It's more painful to a whole lot of other people. I don't nurse things, and I move on. I don't spend a lot of time looking back. Most of the time, I'm lucky. I've been married a long time now, 45 years. And I have somebody who loves the theater and is extremely encouraging and encourages the hard part of it, the part where I'm risking much more. I have a show right now called Love Music, which has played a limited engagement in New York, 10 weeks or something, but to full houses. And I'm as proud of it as anything I've ever worked on, and I'm sure it'll be back and around. And I know from the amount of interest there is in Europe and around the world, it's going to be done in London and in Tokyo and in Israel, and all this in just these 10 weeks. These contracts are all out. So that's now what I'm working for, because it is authentically its own show. And those people who do not recognize it in that comfortable way are the same people who are walking out on West Side Story. What we're talking about is the difference in audiences today, and just a whole shift in the entertainment industry and what it's focused on, which is making money. Not often, but infrequently hitting the jackpot, and that does happen infrequently. It's the most fun I've had in a very long time. We went back and sat the other night, and it makes me feel good that I still have those priorities and the energy's there. And I love the people I worked with, not only the cast, who are extraordinary actors, but Jonathan Tunick's orchestrations of the court vile stuff are magnificent. It was never easy to get the Weill Foundation, but they trust me. And also, I worked with Lottie Lenya in Cabaret, and we were very close. And now I'm some sort of emeritus member of the Weill Foundation because they didn't want to mix up why they'd let me do this. But she actually put me on the Kurt Weill Foundation before she died. She was forming it, and she said, "We need somebody young." Is that a laugh? But I was younger than most of them. A big musical this time, maybe a year and a half away. It's written. The book is by Richard Nelson, who's a great playwright and quite well known here and in England. The lyrics are by Ellen Fitzhugh, who sort of took a break from the theater to have a family, and she's back working. And Jonathan Tunick is co-writing the score with someone else, and I'm going to keep that a secret for. I'll explain why off camera. And it's based on a book by a marvelous Austrian novelist named Joseph Roth, who you perhaps have heard of, who wrote the Radetzky March, which is a great novel. This is another one.